Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Naweed Jabarkil. Today we're delighted to be joined by Mr Tim Callen. Mr Callen is a visiting fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, focusing on the economics of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region. He was formerly the IMF mission chief to Saudi Arabia and head of the GCC Division from 2012 to 2021. And then special advisor to the executive director for Saudi Arabia at the International Monetary Fund from 2021 to 2022. Tim, welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast.
Naweed, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and very much looking forward to our discussion.
Let's start then. Just begin by telling us what the core function is of the Arab Gulf States Institute.
Great. Yeah, so the Arab Gulf States Institute is an independent non-profit institution in Washington, D.C. in the United States. It was established with the aim of highlighting the importance of the relationship between the United States and the Gulf region. The Institute works to increase the understanding of the Gulf region, particularly in the US, across economic, political, social and cultural dimensions. We do a lot of research, which you can find on our website, AGSIW.com. And also we do a lot of event organizations around these issues of, that I just spoke about. So we're small, but I think we have some very interesting research that's done.
And the region and its people quickly, and economies as well, quickly shifting. In the past, Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia were quite sensitive when it came to things like their population statistics, presumably because of the relatively low proportion of citizens in the overall population in many Gulf states, at least. Do those sorts of sensitivities still exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as you said, the situation clearly varies across countries within the Gulf. If you take Saudi Arabia, clearly, in broad terms, maybe 2/3 of the population are nationals and the remaining expatriates. In Qatar or UAE, then clearly it's much more heavily weighted towards expatriates and nationals. My own sense is that the bigger issue in terms of the lack of population data and detailed population data is not so much the sensitivity, although I think that is definitely there in some cases, but really in many cases until quite recently there's been a lack of investment in economic and social data in many of these countries, and conducting a census to get accurate population data is not easy. It takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of training of staff to do that. Saudi has just recently published a new census. It was a long time in the making to do that. So I think, at least to my mind, it's more an issue of resources and, the skills and abilities to do these things rather than sensitivity. And I think, lastly, in the case of Saudi, we have now, interestingly, in the new census, got some detailed data about the composition of the expatriate population in the country by nationality, which is the first time we've seen that.
Yeah, and we're seeing the government also take a more proactive approach when it comes to dealing with those population issues, whether it's things like Saudiization and getting more into of them in the workforce. But just generally then, what's the effect of this been, do you think, on government policy in places like Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about expatriates in the Gulf, the first thing, you have to really point out is that, expatriates do a lot of the jobs in the region, right? Both from unskilled to skilled. Again, it depends, across countries, a mix of skilled and unskilled expatriates. But really, this ability to bring in expatriates has really helped the region grow very quickly and much quicker than it would have been able to do in the absence of, of that influx of labour. So, I think you have to look at the expatriate labour from the point of view of the countries as being a positive in terms of their development and their growth. certainly what we've seen is, these countries have very open labour markets in terms of, the ability to bring expatriate labour in. Of course, less open from the point of view of the expatriate once they're in the country, because, there've been many restrictions through sponsorship systems in terms of what the expatriates can do in the countries and their movement. That's beginning to change in some countries. The other thing I think that we are seeing, and I think UAE particular is a big example of this, is the efforts to try and put in policies that encourage an influx of skilled expatriate labour, more so than probably in the past. So we've seen changes to the visa system, for example, to try and encourage this. The issue maybe for Saudi and I think Oman as well, in terms of having larger shares of national population, is, as you said, there's this challenge of getting the local population into jobs, particularly in the private sector. Traditionally, they've worked more in the public sector, and we've seen quota systems. The most obvious one is NITA cut in Saudi Arabia, to try and shift the balance of the nationals expatriate population in the private sector workforce. If we look at sectors, we're seeing more nationals work clearly in the retail sector, but also more broadly than that. So these policies are certainly having an impact in terms of increasing the share of national labour in the private sector. But of course, research shows they also come with costs in terms of raising the cost to businesses of doing business.
Yeah, and it's not just a demographic shift, but we're also seeing societal shifts at the same time as well. I mean, if you look at women participating in the workforce in the Middle East, it's relatively low compared to some other parts of the world. If you take Western Europe, for example, or the US. But what do you make of this cultural shift as it's being perceived, where women are having more active roles both in the public and private sectors in the region?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's I mean, I think quite a dramatic shift. I mean, particularly if you look at Saudi Arabia, the country I'm most familiar with in the region. I mean, we give you a few numbers which I think really show the size of the the changes that are taking place. Over the last 6 years, the labour force participation rate of Saudi women has doubled from around 17% to 35%. Employment of Saudi women has increased by 45%, and the unemployment rate for Saudi women is halved, 33% to just under 16%. I mean, these are really huge changes in a pretty short period of time, and those women are bringing many are highly educated, they're very well motivated, so they're bringing their skills which will raise growth and productivity in the economy. Beyond, they're also clearly personal benefits, household income benefits, but just from an economic growth point of view, this is going to be very beneficial. Now, on the other hand, they are still relatively low. Throughout the Middle East region, participation rates tend to be lower than in many other parts of the world. So there's more to do in terms of continuing to raise participation rates. What can be done in that area? I guess one thing is, I think that the whole demonstration effect of having more women in senior positions then helps encourage other women into the workforce. We're still in the situation where women are increasingly moving up into senior positions, but it's still male dominated, I think, in the region in senior positions. So more women into senior positions will help with the demonstration effect there. And then I think the other thing is just making sure in companies people are in terms of HR policies are aware that the benefits of women in the workforce are doing things that will encourage and make sure that they are welcomed into the labour force, and that'll be good for economies going forward if we can do that.
Yeah, and it certainly is palpable. Every time almost that I go to Saudi Arabia, you do notice a significant difference when it comes to those societal changes. But looking at the economic situation then, one thing that most Gulf states have in common, all of them, is trying to diversify their economies away from fossil fuels. What do you make of efforts there? I mean, you've got the likes of Dubai, which is seen as a bit of a gold standard when it comes to economic diversification. But how do you think the energy transition and the need to move away from fossil fuels and towards net zero emissions is accelerating or affecting the move to diversify economy?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's a push to diversify across the Gulf. Dubai, as you said, is is seen as a gold standard, but it's also true that Dubai has never really had the oil of Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and so on. And I think if we look across economic history, there are very few examples of countries which have which are so dependent on oil successfully diversifying. So that gives a sense of the huge challenge that is being faced. But I think it's also true that not many countries trying to diversify have had the huge financial resources that many Gulf countries have, nor the apparent political will at the moment to try and bring about diversification, which I think we're particularly seeing in Saudi Arabia, but true in other countries. So I've done a little bit of work on Saudi Arabia looking at progress with diversification, and I think you can definitely see progress over the last 10 years, but that still leaves the economy still dominated by oil, so there's much further to go on that side. And if we look at areas where there is diversification, clearly we see it in the growth in petrochemicals, although you can argue whether that's really true diversification because of the links to oil, but it does bring additional value added. But in Saudi, I think we're seeing it in the tourism sector, where tourism has clearly had religious visitors for many years, but we're now beginning to see non-religious tourism coming into the country, and we're also seeing the development of the mining sector. Of course, efforts are ongoing to try and create more of an industrial base. I think that's harder at this stage to see the benefits of, but it's clearly going to take time to do that as well. So, those are my broad thoughts on this area.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, particularly with Saudi Arabia and the economic progress taking place there, at least from an investment perspective, is the regional competition that's heating up as well between states in the UAE, the likes of Qatar, but also Saudi Arabia, when it comes to attracting that economic investment moving forward. But one thing diversifying economies may help governments do is to stop looking too closely at the break-even price of oil, which has traditionally been really a bedrock of their fiscal budgets. You say that's a poor indicator, you've written in the past, of fiscal policies focusing on the break-even price of oil. Just tell us why you think that is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so maybe, just as background to define the break-even oil price for listeners. So, what we would define as the fiscal break-even oil price is that the price at which we'll balance the budget given oil production and the taxes and dividends that would accrue to the government from that, and expenditure. So take expenditure, oil production is given, work out what the oil price is to balance the budget. I mean, in my view, there are at least three weaknesses with that. I mean, first of all, everything's always moving, right? I mean, if oil production, the oil price does something, say it drops, the tendency in the region is that you will cut production to try and change the price. So the oil price and production are interlinked, not sort of independent as is assumed. And of course, government spending is always changing. We look in the region, the oil price goes up, usually government spending goes up as well. So these are, I think, weaknesses in terms of the price. And when you see in a report by analysts or in the media a break-even oil price quoted, normally it's already out of date by the time you read it, wherever you've read it, because things have changed. Secondly, if we're looking at many countries, there's a lot of spending now going on outside of the central government. So again, Saudi Arabia, we see a lot of spending going through the public investment fund now. So that is not included in the central government data. Of course, there's very little information available often on these these quasi-government entities, but really from the point of view of the overall fiscal impact, I need to include the spending from these entities in it, which is very hard to do. So that sort of devalues a little bit the oil price calculation at the central government level. And then, the third reason I think is a weakness is, it assumes you need to balance the government budget each year, which is just not the case, right? You can run deficits, you can run surpluses. It depends on the economic situation. If my economy is not doing very well, I might want to spend more to support growth, and that running a fiscal deficit may be the right thing to do. So it's a bit of an erroneous assumption to assume the budget will also be balanced. So my preferred methodology here is to look in more detail at the fiscal accounts, both revenues, expenditures, rather than get caught up on one headline number, which it sounds good in the media to quote it, but I think has very little underlying economic value.
Yeah, particularly consider the long-term strategic reasoning behind a lot of the investments that we're seeing, particularly whether it's capital investments or in strategic sectors like tourism, as you say, take the new airport being built in Riyadh. But just moving on then, I just wanted to pick up on something else that you've spoken about before, and advising on the need for the formation of better institutions in the region's areas. I mean, are we there now with the institutions, or are stronger ones still needed?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of progress in strengthening, and here I'm talking about economic institutions, not broader political institutions and so on. But again, let me talk about Saudi Arabia a bit, where I'm most familiar. If you look at what's happened since the publication of Vision 2030, we've seen the establishment of of CEDA, which is the overall sort of economic and development committee, to bring sort of greater, I think, coordination and clarity across different dimensions of economic policy in Saudi Arabia. I think that's very important in terms of improving policy coordination. And then if we look at the Ministry of Finances, sort of one of the key fiscal institutions, we've seen, I think, again, a lot of changes in terms of improving the skills and training of the staff. We've seen much more structure put around the budget process, how that's done from going from the year to the start of the budget all the way through to the publication of the budget numbers. We've seen more of a medium-term fiscal framework put in place, so it's not just focused on the current year, but they're also looking at what's going to happen in the next 2 years. So I think these are all part of what I would call strengthening economic institutions, more generally in this case fiscal institutions. But I think there is still quite a lot of work to do in this area. One thing I'm beginning to get a little worried on in Saudi Arabia is this big increase in spending we've seen the last couple of years, and with the pre-budget statement released at the weekend, again we've seen the projection of spending exceeding budget as oil prices or oil revenues have exceeded earlier expectations. So I think that what you would hope eventually to see is a fiscal framework that was not so susceptible to spending moving with the oil price. We've certainly seen progress compared to where we were a decade ago, but I still see further strengthening needed.
Yeah, and I think to pick up on the point you made with the previous answer is it may be some of these changes and what's happening in places like Saudi Arabia are bigger issues and wider issues that can't simply be factored and measured in financial terms, which is one of the problems you have when you look at it in purely economic terms. But one question then to finish off. As the energy transition proceeds, we've heard from the IEA saying peak oil demand, we've heard about it for years and years, is going to happen, Fatih Birol, the head, says within this decade. Do you think there's a great danger then of stranded assets, both above and below ground, in this region in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are clearly very differing views as to what the future of fossil fuel demand and supply are. You clearly have the IEA view. If you then listen to the Saudi energy minister and OPEC, you'll get a different view. But I think what's important to remember, even if we reach peak energy demand, that doesn't mean demand for fossil fuels is suddenly vanishing, right? It will, continue, I suspect, for many years to come. Even if it's, declining demand, then it'll still be there. And of course, producers in the Gulf region in general are amongst the lowest cost producers in the world, so they're going to be amongst the last to get hit in terms of sort of the ability to extract and sell their their oil assets profitably. I think other things also, in terms of oil demand are less clear to me. I mean, one is, even if we're in a position of burning less fossil fuels, there are other demand for fossil fuels, plastics, petrochemicals. Maybe there'll be even new things developed going forward. Secondly, I think is how viable is carbon capture technology at scale? I mean, clearly we're seeing investments in that area, but is this something that is realistically going to roll out in a meaningful way? And if it does, what does that mean for the demand for fossil fuel? And then thirdly, the whole technology in terms of oil exploration and extraction changes hugely, right? So what we think of oil reserves at the moment, in 20 years those oil reserves may be considerably bigger or potentially bigger because of the technology changes. So I think if you add all of that together, is there a risk of stranded assets in the region? Yes, there probably is. Those assets could increase in terms of as the technology increases over time. But at the same time, my sense is that oil demand from the region is going to be there for a considerable while to come. So yes, there's some risk, but I don't see that as a huge risk at this stage.
Particularly if you consider the shift that all Gulf states really are having towards the global south and emerging markets in the developing world. So perhaps that's a reflection of things to come on that final point. But that's all we've got time for. That concludes our interview today. Tim, thank you very much. That's Tim Callen for providing us with some great analysis, great insights that I'm sure hopefully our listeners enjoyed. Tim, on behalf of the foundation, thank you very much, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time as well. Thank you.
And of course, thank you very much for listening. Be sure to keep up to date with all of the Al-Attiyah Foundation's work by following us on Twitter and on YouTube. You can find us under our name. I've been Naweed Jabarkil. Thank you and goodbye.